My name is Ian Lee. I was asked to examine the economic health of the ecosystem of small business in Canada. By way of background, I was in a bank just down the street in Ottawa, the Bank of Montreal in the Spark Street Mall, now the Sir John A. Macdonald Reception Centre, and I was there for many years lending money before I went back to school, and I lent a lot of money to small business, millions of dollars to small business, where I first learned about the problems facing it. Since then, for the past 35 years, I've taught and researched the competitiveness of firms and industries in Canada and the US in the Strategy Capstone course, in the BCom and the MBA programs. As is my practice in teaching and research in this study, I used empirical trend data from Statistics Canada, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, ISED, Bank of Canada, the Monetary Policy Reports, the Financial Stability Reports, as well as the Business Development Bank. And of course, I also used data, some excellent data from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and Restaurants Canada. What the data is showing is that approximately half of all small business in Canada, and especially restaurants, are either losing money or breaking even with very little margin for error. So the empirical data drives anyone who looks at the stats that are in this report to recognize the serious challenges and difficulties facing small business and especially restaurants. And to give away the punchline, if you will, I conclude based on this research, this empirical data, that contrary to past arguments in years gone by for suspension or reduction of EI premiums to stimulate job growth, I argued in this report that the need today is to provide meaningful help to thousands of firms on the very precipice of survival. So that brings us to who cares? Why is small business important? And we have to turn to the data. At the outset, it must be stated that the private sector is the engine of employment in Canada, accounting for approximately 16 million of the 20 million Canadians employed. That's StatsCan data. When we drill down into the private sector data for employment, we learn that 1.2 million are small business, or 98% of all the companies in Canada are small business. When we turn to the employment aggregates, we learn that as of 2022, small business across this country employed 5.7 million, or 47% of the private sector employment. And in terms of GDP, the small business sector, the SME sector, accounts for almost 50% of GDP. So this is huge. This is enormous, the impact on Canadian society. Food and accommodation sector is the fourth largest service sector in Canada with 80,000 businesses. Now turning right to the essence of what I argue is the justification. And for those watching, I urge you to turn to page 16, 17, 18, 19, which is the hard data on business insolvencies and increased risk of insolvency. What I've got there, what I provided there, was the small business insolvencies, which is from the Superintendent of Bankruptcy in Canada, which is a department or a unit within ISED. They publish excellent stats on bankruptcies and insolvency. And what it shows is, the trend line is the critical point, is that it's been going up very dramatically for retail and restaurants and accommodation. The next graph following that shows the monthly number of restaurant and accommodation bankruptcies in 2024. So this is very fresh data, and the trend line is very dramatically up. So that's on page 17. So there are many factors bearing down on small business. I saw this when I was in the bank many years ago, and I've studied it ever since. And it's important to step back and look at the big picture of business, because this is not often talked about in policy in Ottawa. Any business, small, medium, or large, faces four broad categories of expenditures. Cost of goods sold, the raw materials you get from your suppliers. Property, plant, and equipment, which is the factory or the premises of your building and your machinery. Thirdly, the wages, and fourthly, the taxes. Well, I hope you realize right away that cost of goods sold, you can't go to your suppliers and tell you to cut because you're in trouble as a restaurant and tell your food suppliers to go and cut the price by 50%. So that's basically a fixed cost they're facing. Likewise, property, plant, equipment, or premises is set by the markets in the real estate market. Thirdly, wages, well, minimum wages are set by government, and above that are set by labor markets. So what this suggests is that the taxes, the payroll taxes and the corporate taxes, are set by the discretion of Parliament and the government. Now, in a major new study from ESDC, Employment Service Development Canada, a remarkable study. I've been looking for this study for years. They found it's an empirical, a very tough, hard empirical study, identifying firms that are potentially most sensitive to EI premium changes. This is last year, 2023. And I'm going to quote directly because it's so important. Smaller sized firms tend to have higher employment insurance premium ratios, the EIPR, which is the ratio of EI premiums paid by the employers to their total payroll. Well, accommodation and food services has the highest EIPR of any industry in Canada at 1.9. In plain English, EI premiums are a larger share of payroll costs for small business than for big business. So this suggests that a comprehensive study is long overdue of the EI program and fund to identify the insurance components of EI versus the social benefits over time. Restated, it appears that partly because of the very rapid increase in the minimum wage rate, far beyond the inflation rate of the past 10 years, and the data, that graph is in there as well from Stats Canada. Government has been using small business with higher than necessary EI rates to achieve social objectives beyond mere insurance. So what I then concluded was, given the precarious state of so many small businesses, and they account for so much of employment, 50% of all the jobs in the private sector in Canada, that there is an urgent need for government to step in and address the problem. So I accept and endorse the proposal by Restaurants Canada to reduce the premium to 1.58%, the EI premiums, as an interim measure until presumably after the next election, which is soon, to do a more comprehensive study of taxation and specifically of payroll taxes because of the disproportionate impact of payroll taxes on small business and the precarious nature of small business in Canada, which employs so many of our young people. I am particularly concerned by this because I teach a lot of students every year. I've been teaching for 38 years, and my students, every last one of them, have part-time jobs. And so this is really important. People may not realize how heavily dependent students are on the restaurant employment sector to finance their education, to go to college and university. This is not a trivial issue. So the one other point I wanted to bring out, again, justifying this study, is that the payroll taxes in Canada, per the OECD, we are an outlier. Canada is an extreme outlier at 2.4%. Most of the countries, the European countries, are much, much lower. They rely much less on payroll taxes than Canada. So there's an additional argument beyond the injustice for small business. There's an additional argument because we are an outlier compared to other OECD countries. So in conclusion, the rebalancing of payroll taxes will reduce the burden that falls disproportionately on small business and restaurants, according to the ESDC study. And at the same time, the reduced premiums will contribute to small businesses facing these very tough times that they're in. And it should be pointed, it'll also put more money in the pockets of our young people who are employed in accommodation and food service if the premiums are reduced. I urge you to read the report and look at the study, at the stats, the tables and the graphs in there, because they're very informative, and they're very empirical and reliable. Thank you.